In the quiet glow of a lantern, a weary traveler stood at her door, clothes torn, eyes heavy with sorrow. "You can stay tonight," she whispered, offering him shelter without a second thought. To her, he was just a lost soul seeking warmth. But behind those tired eyes hid a secret. He was the long, lost heir of the ranch she worked on. And by morning, her life would never be the same again. Eleanor Hayes stood at the window, with her palm flat against the cold glass, watching the blizzard turn the world into nothing but white noise and motion. The lantern on the table behind her threw her shadow long and thin across the floorboards, stretching toward the door like something already reaching for what was coming. She hadn't meant to be awake. Sleep had been impossible for months now, ever since Thomas died and left her alone with 200 acres of frozen earth and a house that echoed too much when she moved through it. The storm had been building since sundown. Now it was full dark, and the wind was throwing fists of snow against the walls hard enough to make the chimney groan. She pulled her shawl tighter and turned away from the window, no sense watching. Storms like this didn't ask permission, they just took what they wanted. She was halfway to the fire when she heard it. A sound, faint, beneath the wind. She stopped. It came again, a dull, heavy thud against wood. Not the gate, not the barn, the porch. Her breath caught. No one came to the ranch after dark. Not anymore. Not since the war left too many men rootless and bitter, wandering the valley with nothing but hunger and grievance. She'd learned to lock the door early and keep the rifle within reach. Thomas used to say she worried too much, but Thomas wasn't here to say anything now. The sound came again, louder this time, a weight collapsing against the door. Eleanor crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted the rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Her hands didn't shake. She wouldn't let them. She moved to the door and stood there, listening. The wind roared. The fire crackled, and somewhere beyond the wood, someone was breathing. She pressed her ear to the door. Help. The word was barely there. A rasp. A ghost of a voice buried under the storm. Eleanor closed her eyes and made a choice she knew she'd regret or remember for the rest of her life. She slid the bolt back, turned the handle, and pulled the door open. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow poured into the house, swirling around her boots, and for a moment she couldn't see anything but white. Then the shape at her feet shifted, and she looked down. A man, collapsed against the doorframe. His coat was frozen stiff, his hat gone, his face half buried in his arm. Snow clung to his hair, his shoulders, the bloody tear in his sleeve. He didn't move, didn't look up, just lay there like something the storm had spit out and left to die. Eleanor crouched down, rifle still in one hand, and touched his shoulder. His coat was like ice. She shook him. Nothing, she shook harder. Can you hear me? His head turned, slowly. His eyes cracked open, pale gray, unfocused, rimmed with red. He looked at her like he wasn't sure she was real. I can't. His voice broke. I can't feel my legs. Eleanor didn't think. She dropped the rifle, grabbed him under the arms, and dragged him inside. He was heavy, dead weight. His boots scraped across the threshold, and she had to brace her back against the doorframe to get him over it. The wind shoved at her the whole time, trying to push them both back out into the storm, but she held on. She always held on. When she finally got him inside, she kicked the door shut and bolted it. The silence that followed felt like the world had been holding its breath. She knelt beside him. His eyes were closed again. His breathing was shallow, uneven. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat. The pulse was there, but weak. Frostbite on his hands. Blood crusted along his temple. His lips were cracked and colorless. Stay with me, she said, though she wasn't sure why. He didn't look like the kind of man who listened. She pulled off his coat, then his boots. His socks were wet through, his toes already purple. She cursed under her breath and moved faster. She dragged him closer to the fire, rolled him onto the rug, and piled every blanket she owned on top of him. Then she filled a pot with water and set it over the flames. She didn't have much, but she had this. While the water heated, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked. He was younger than she'd thought. Maybe 30, strong build, rough hands, a scar running from his collarbone down beneath his shirt. His face was hard in the way men's faces got when they'd been cold for too long, not in temperature, but in life. She didn't recognize him, but something about the way he carried himself, even unconscious, made her uneasy. She leaned closer and pulled the collar of his shirt aside to check the wound on his shoulder. That's when she saw it, a brand, small, burned into the skin just below his collarbone, a circle with a line through it. The mark of the Holt Ranch. Eleanor's breath stopped. She knew that brand. Everyone in the valley knew that brand. It was the mark of the family that had swallowed half the territory 20 years ago, buying up land from families who couldn't pay their taxes, foreclosing on debts that had been invented in back rooms over whiskey and handshakes. Her father had lost everything to the Holts, his ranch, his pride, his will to keep living. She'd been 16 when they came to take the deed. She remembered the way her father had stood on the porch with his rifle across his lap, staring at the horizon like he could will the world to be different. But it wasn't, and 3 months later, he was dead. She pulled her hand back from the stranger's chest like she'd been burned. This man was a Holt, or had been, or worked for them. It didn't matter. The brand was there. The proof was there. And she'd just dragged him into her home. She stood up, hands trembling now, and backed away from him. Her mind raced. She should throw him out. Let the storm finish what it started. He didn't deserve her mercy. His family had taken everything from hers. But as she stood there, staring down at him, she saw something else. The way his hand was curled against his ribs. The way his breath hitched every few seconds like his body was barely holding on. The way the firelight caught the hollow beneath his cheekbone. He wasn't a name, he wasn't a brand, he was just a man dying on her floor. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled. She hated herself a little for what she did next. She knelt back down, wrung out a cloth in the warm water, and pressed it to his forehead. She cleaned the blood from his temple, checked his ribs for breaks, wrapped his feet in dry wool. She worked in silence, methodical, her jaw tight. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and somewhere deep in her chest, something she thought had frozen solid a long time ago began to thaw. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. The storm outside had settled into a low, steady roar. She sat beside him, her back against the wall, the rifle across her lap. She didn't sleep. She just watched him breathe. Around dawn, his eyes opened. He didn't sit up, didn't speak, just turned his head slowly until he was looking at her. Eleanor met his gaze. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rough, broken. "You should have left me outside." Eleanor didn't blink. "I know." He looked at her a moment longer, then closed his eyes again. She stayed where she was. The light from the window grew pale and gray, filtering through the snow still falling outside. The house was quiet now, too quiet. She could hear every creak of the floorboards, every breath he took, every beat of her own heart. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know why he'd been out there or what he was running from. But she knew one thing. Mercy had a cost, and she'd just paid it. Outside, the storm buried every trace of the truth he carried. But inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor Hayes wasn't alone. The wind kept blowing, the snow kept falling, and the man with the brand on his chest kept breathing. That was enough, for now. But when dawn finally broke through the storm, mercy had already changed the course of both their lives. The snow stopped falling sometime before first light, leaving the world wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Eleanor woke to it, not the quiet, but the weight of it pressing against the walls, the windows, the very air inside the house. She was still sitting against the wall, the rifle across her knees, her body stiff from cold and stillness. The fire had burned down to embers. The stranger was still asleep on the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven rhythm. She stood slowly, her joints protesting, and crossed to the window. Outside, the land had disappeared. Everything was white. The fence posts were buried to their tops. The barn was a dark shape barely visible through the drifts. The road was gone. The valley was gone. There was nothing but snow and sky and the thin line of smoke rising from her chimney. They were snowed in completely. Elinor pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She'd seen storms like this before. They didn't clear in a day, sometimes not in a week, which meant she was trapped here with a man she didn't know, didn't trust, and couldn't afford to keep. Behind her, the stranger stirred. She turned. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight. He didn't look at her, just lay there breathing like he was trying to decide whether being alive was worth the effort. Elinor picked up the poker and stirred the coals back to life, adding wood until the flames caught again. The warmth spread slowly through the room, pushing back the cold that had crept in overnight. She moved to the stove and filled the kettle, her movements automatic, practiced. She didn't speak. Neither did he. When the water boiled, she poured 2 cups of coffee bitter, black, the last of the grounds she'd been rationing since November. She set one on the floor beside him and took the other to the table. She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup and waited. He didn't touch the coffee, just kept staring at the ceiling. "You got a name?" she asked finally. He was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Calder." "Calder what?" "Just Calder." Elinor nodded slowly. She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. "Not yet. You're welcome to stay till the snow clears," she said. "After that, you're gone." He turned his head then, just enough to look at her. His eyes were pale gray, sharp despite the exhaustion in them. "Didn't ask to stay, didn't ask to freeze to death on my porch either, but here we are." He looked at her a moment longer, then turned his gaze back to the ceiling. Fair enough. They didn't speak again for the rest of the morning. Elinor moved through the house like he wasn't there. She swept the floor, fed the fire, checked the pantry. She counted what was left: half a sack of flour, a jar of preserves, dried beans, a little salt pork. Enough for one person for a few weeks, enough for 2 if they were careful. She did the math in her head and didn't like the answer. Calder didn't move much. He sat up eventually, slow and stiff, and drank the coffee. Then he just sat there, staring at the fire, his hands wrapped around the cup like he was trying to remember what warmth felt like. His face was drawn, pale beneath the bruises and frostbite. He looked like a man who'd been running for a long time and had finally run out of road. Elinor didn't ask what he was running from. She had a feeling she didn't want to know. By midday, the cabin was warm enough that she didn't need the shawl anymore. She hung it on the peg by the door and turned to find Calder watching her. Not staring, just watching, like he was trying to figure her out. "You live here alone?" he asked. "I do now." He nodded. Didn't ask anything else. She crossed to the stove and started cutting potatoes into a pot. "You hungry? I can wait." "Wasn't asking if you could wait, was asking if you're hungry." He hesitated, then nodded. She added water, salt, a little of the pork. It wasn't much, but it was warm. And right now, warm was enough. While the stew cooked, she sat at the table and watched him out of the corner of her eye. He was still sitting by the fire, his head tipped back against the wall, his eyes half closed. His hands were rough, calloused in the way hands got from years of hard work. Ranchers' hands. She'd seen enough of them to know. But there was something else too. Something in the way he held himself. A kind of stillness that didn't come from peace. It came from control, like he was used to being watched, used to not being trusted. She didn't like it. When the stew was ready, she ladled it into 2 bowls and brought one to him. He took it without a word and ate slowly, carefully, like he wasn't sure his stomach would keep it down. She ate at the table, her eyes on the window, watching the light shift across the snow. After a while, he spoke. "Thank you." Elinor didn't look at him. "Don't thank me. Just don't make me regret it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I won't." She didn't believe him, but she nodded anyway. The afternoon passed in silence. Calder slept. Elinor mended a tear in one of the blankets, her needle moving in steady rhythm, her mind somewhere else. The house was too quiet. It had been too quiet for months now. She used to hate the noise Thomas talking, the hands coming and going, the constant motion of a working ranch. Now she'd give anything to hear it again. She glanced at Calder. He was asleep, his breathing deep and even now. In the firelight, he looked younger, less hard, almost human. She looked away. By evening, the cold had crept back in. Elinor banked the fire and pulled the curtains closed. She lit the lantern and set it on the table, then sat down with the ledger she kept in the drawer. Numbers, expenses, things she couldn't afford. She ran her finger down the column and felt the familiar weight settle in her chest. Behind her, Calder stirred. She heard him sit up, heard the creak of the floorboards as he stood. She didn't turn around. "You need help with anything?" he asked. "No, I can work, soon as I'm steady." "I didn't ask you to work." "I know." She turned then slow and looked at him. He was standing by the fire, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Why? Because I owe you." "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." Elinor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the ledger. "Fine. You can start with the barn. Roof's been leaking since October. Didn't have time to fix it before the snow hit." "I'll take a look tomorrow." She nodded, didn't say anything else. That night, she gave him the spare room, the one Thomas used to use for storage. It was small, cold, but it had a bed. She brought him another blanket and left it on the chair without a word. He nodded his thanks. She closed the door and went back to her own room. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind pick up again outside. She thought about the brand on his chest. The name he wouldn't give. The way he looked at her like he was waiting for her to turn him out. She thought about mercy, and what it cost, and somewhere deep in the house, she heard him cough, once, twice, then nothing. Elinor closed her eyes and waited for morning. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, endless, covering the tracks, covering the past, covering everything but the truth. As the snow softened, and tracks appeared in the thaw, truth began to walk toward them from beyond the ridge. Elinor woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves, a rhythm she hadn't heard in weeks. The air in the house felt different, not warm, but no longer knife, sharp with cold. She rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, and stepped out onto the porch. The world had changed overnight. The snow was still deep, but it was soft now, yielding, and in the distance she could see the dark line of the creek running again, freed from its shell of ice. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was coming. She stood there for a moment, her breath misting in the air, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence anymore. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk called. The barn door creaked in the wind, and from inside the house she heard footsteps. Calder appeared in the doorway behind her, his coat already on. He looked better than he had a week ago. The color had come back to his face. The hollows beneath his eyes weren't as deep. He moved like a man who'd found his footing again. "Morning," he said. Elinor nodded. "Morning." He stepped past her and looked out at the land, his eyes scanning the horizon the way ranchers did, checking fence lines, weather, the shape of the day ahead. It was a habit she recognized, one she'd seen in Thomas, in her father, in every man who'd ever worked land that didn't forgive mistakes. "I'll start on the barn," Calder said. "Roof first." Elinor replied. "Everything else can wait." He nodded and walked down the steps, his boots breaking through the crust of snow with each step. Elinor watched him go, then turned back inside. She had her own work to do. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both understood. Calder worked from first light until dusk, fixing the barn roof, mending fence posts, clearing snow from the pathways between the house and the outbuildings. Elinor kept the house, tended the horses, cooked what little they had. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The work spoke for them, but something had shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the space where trust could grow if given time. Elinor noticed things. The way Calder moved around the ranch, not like a hired hand learning the layout, but like someone who already knew it. the way he handled the tools, the horses, the weight of a beam across his shoulder. He worked with the kind of efficiency that came from years of doing the same tasks over and over until they became reflex. He didn't ask where things were. He just found them. It bothered her, but she didn't say anything. One afternoon, she brought him coffee while he was working on the fence near the eastern pasture. He was hammering a new post into the ground, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. He looked up when she approached, took the cup she offered, and drank half of it in one pull. "Thank you," he said. Elinor nodded. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the pasture. "You've done this before." "Done what?" "Ranch work." He was quiet for a beat too long. Then he said, "Some. Where? Here and there." Elinor turned to look at him. "You're not much for straight answers, are you?" Calder met her gaze. His expression didn't change. "No, ma'am, I'm not." She should have pressed. Should have demanded to know who he was and where he came from. But something in his eyes stopped her. Not anger, not defiance. Just a kind of weariness that made her think maybe he'd been answering questions his whole life and none of them had ever helped. So she let it go. "Fence looks good," she said instead. "It'll hold." She nodded and walked back to the house, feeling his eyes on her the whole way. That night, they ate together at the table for the first time. Elinor made biscuits and gravy, nothing fancy, but it filled the belly and tasted like something other than survival. Calder ate in silence, his head down, his movements careful. Like he was still getting used to the idea that the food wasn't going to disappear. Halfway through the meal, Elinor spoke. "You don't have to stay in the house if you don't want to. There's a bunkhouse out back. Hasn't been used in a while, but it's dry." Calder looked up. "You want me to move out there? I'm saying you can, if you want." He studied her for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I'm fine where I am, unless it's a problem." "It's not." He nodded and went back to his food. Elinor watched him across the table. She wondered what he was running from, wondered if it would catch up to him here, wondered if she'd be able to live with herself if it did. But she didn't ask. The days grew longer. The snow receded in patches, revealing mud and dead grass and the bones of the land beneath. The air smelled like wet earth and pine resin, sharp and clean. The horses grew restless, eager to move, and Elinor let them out into the near pasture for the first time in weeks. They ran, kicking up snow and mud, their breath steaming in the morning light. Calder stood at the fence, watching them. Elinor walked up beside him. "They needed that," she said. "Yeah." They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the horses run. It felt strange, comfortable and strange at the same time, like something she'd forgotten how to do. After a while, Calder spoke. "You ran this place alone all winter." "I did." "That's not easy." Elinor shrugged, didn't have a choice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're tougher than you look." She glanced at him. "I look plenty tough." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. It was the first time she'd seen anything like humor on his face. It changed him, made him look less like a man carved out of stone and more like someone who might have laughed once, a long time ago. Elinor looked away, back at the horses. She didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee already brewing. She came downstairs to find Calder at the stove, frying eggs in the skillet. He glanced up when she entered. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Figured I'd make myself useful." Elinor blinked. "You cook?" "Some." She sat down at the table, still half-asleep, and watched him work. He moved around the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. No wasted motion, no fuss. Just eggs, bread, coffee. Simple, good. He set a plate in front of her and took his own to the other side of the table. They ate in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, less wary, less brittle. After breakfast, Elinor cleared the plates while Calder went outside to check the horses. She stood at the window, watching him cross the yard, and felt something inside her shift. Something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not exactly, but something close to peace. She didn't trust it, but she didn't push it away either. That afternoon, she found herself in the barn, sorting through old tack and supplies. The barn was dim and dusty, shafts of light cutting through the cracks in the walls. She was pulling down a box from a high shelf when it slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, spilling papers and old ledgers across the dirt. Elinor swore under her breath and knelt down to gather them up. Most of it was junk, old receipts, bills of sale, things her father had kept and she'd never had the heart to throw away. But as she reached for the last ledger, something caught her eye. A signature at the bottom of a deed. She froze. The name was written in careful, slanted script. Formal, legal, the kind of signature that carried weight. Calder Holt. Elinor's heart stopped. She picked up the paper with trembling hands and read it again. And again, the deed was old, dated nearly 15 years ago. A transfer of property from one ranch to another, a sale, a foreclosure, her father's land, and the name at the bottom was Calder Holt, heir to the Holt Ranch. The man she'd been feeding, sheltering, trusting. Elinor stood slowly, the paper still in her hand, her mind racing. She looked toward the barn door, where Calder was working somewhere beyond, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. He hadn't just worked on a ranch before, he'd owned one, the one that destroyed her family. She stood there in the dim light, the paper trembling in her hand, and tried to breathe, tried to think. But all she could hear was her father's voice the day they came to take the land. The way he'd said, "They'll take everything, and they won't even remember your name." Elinor folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked out of the barn, her jaw set, her hands steady. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She couldn't. Not until she understood what it meant. Not until she knew if he was here by accident or design. But as she walked back to the house, she felt the warmth of the past few weeks drain away like water through her fingers. Outside, the sun was shining, the snow was melting, the world looked soft and new. But Elinor Hayes had learned long ago that the warmth of spring often hid the storm clouds that gathered unseen. And this time, the storm had a name. She lay in the dark with the folded deed under her pillow, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the windows felt like something trying to get in. Or maybe trying to get out. Calder Holt. The name sat in her chest like a stone. She'd been feeding him, working beside him, laughing God help her. She'd almost laughed with him yesterday when one of the horses had knocked his hat off and trampled it into the mud. She'd felt something close to companionship, close to trust, and all the while he'd been lying to her, not with words, with silence, which was worse. By the time dawn broke, Elinor had made her decision. She rose, dressed, and came downstairs to find him already at the table, mending a bridle. He looked up when she entered, his expression neutral, unreadable. "Morning," he said. Elinor didn't answer. She crossed to the stove, poured herself coffee, and stood with her back to him, staring out the window at the pale light spreading across the valley. "We need to go into town," she said finally. Calder was quiet for a moment. "All right, what for?" "Supplies, and I need to settle an account at the mercantile." "You want me to come?" Elinor turned to face him. "You got a reason not to." He held her gaze, searching for something in her expression. Then he shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Then hitch the wagon. We leave in an hour." She walked past him and up the stairs before he could say anything else. She didn't trust herself to speak. Didn't trust what might come out if she did. The ride into town took most of the morning. The road was muddy, rutted with melt and half frozen in the shade. The wagon lurched and groaned, and the horses strained against the weight. Elinor kept her eyes on the road. Calder sat beside her, silent, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't ask why she was so quiet. Maybe he already knew. The town of Cedar Bend sat in a hollow between two ridges, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single muddy street. It wasn't much. A mercantile, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, a blacksmith shop that doubled as a livery. Maybe 40 souls lived here year-round, fewer now, since the war. Elinor pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile and set the brake. She climbed down without waiting for Calder and walked inside, the bell over the door ringing sharp in the quiet. The store smelled like coffee, leather, and lamp oil. Mr. Brennan stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled up, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when she entered and smiled. "Mrs. Hayes, good to see you. Wasn't sure you'd make it in with all that snow." "It's melting," Eleanor said. She set her list on the counter. "I need these, and I'll settle last month's account if you've got the ledger." Brennan nodded and pulled the book from beneath the counter. He flipped through the pages, running his finger down the columns. "Let's see here. Yes, that's $8.40. Eleanor reached into her coat and counted out the bills, setting them on the counter one at a time. Brennan took them, made a note in the ledger, and began gathering her supplies. The bell over the door rang again. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder and felt her stomach tighten. Calder had come inside. He stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He didn't look at her. Just stood there, waiting, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there or not. Brennan looked up, his smile faded. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. "Hired hand," Eleanor said, her voice flat, "helping with the fence work." Brennan's eyes narrowed. He looked at Calder for a long moment, then back at Eleanor. "He got a name, Calder," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Brennan's expression shifted. Something cold flickered across his face. "Calder what?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but Calder spoke first. "Just Calder." Brennan set down the sack of flour he'd been holding and leaned forward on the counter. "You knew around here, passing through." "Passing through where?" Calder's jaw tightened. "Nowhere in particular." The air in the store grew thick. Eleanor could feel it, the shift, the suspicion, the way Brennan's gaze had gone from curious to sharp. She'd seen that look before. It was the look men got when they smelled trouble and decided they wanted a piece of it. "Funny thing," Brennan said slowly, "we don't get many strangers passing through in the dead of winter, especially not ones who look like they've been running." "I'm not running," Calder said quietly. "Didn't say you were, just making an observation." Eleanor stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan, if you've got my supplies ready, I'd like to get back before the road gets worse." Brennan looked at her, then at Calder. Then back at her. "You sure you know who you're keeping company with, Mrs. Hayes?" "I know exactly who I'm keeping company with." "Do you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor took the sack of flour from the counter and handed it to Calder without looking at him. "Take this to the wagon." Calder hesitated. Then he took the sack and walked out, the bell ringing behind him. Brennan waited until the door closed. Then he leaned closer. "Eleanor, listen to me. I don't know what that man told you, but you need to be careful. I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can, but that doesn't mean you should have to." Eleanor met his eyes. "He's working, that's all. When the work's done, he'll be gone." Brennan shook his head slowly. "I hope you're right, because men like that don't usually leave. They just take what they came for and move on." Eleanor didn't answer. She gathered the rest of her supplies, paid, and walked out. Calder was standing by the wagon, loading the sacks into the bed. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. Just kept working, his movements tight, controlled. Eleanor climbed onto the seat and picked up the reins. "Let's go," she said. They were halfway down the street when she heard the voice. "Well, I'll be damned. Is that Calder Holt?" Eleanor's blood went cold. She turned to see Sheriff Danner standing outside the saloon, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a slow smile spreading across his face. He was a big man, broad, shouldered and mean-eyed, the kind of man who liked his authority a little too much. Calder didn't move, didn't answer. Danner stepped into the street, blocking their path. "It is you. Didn't think I'd ever see you back in this valley. Thought you were too good for us now." "I'm just passing through," Calder said evenly. "Passing through," Danner repeated, like he was tasting the words. "That what you call hiding out at the widow's place?" Eleanor's grip tightened on the reins. "He's working for me, Sheriff." "That a problem?" Danner's eyes shifted to her. "Might be, depends on what he's working toward. He's mending fences, that's all." "Is it?" Danner looked back at Calder, Funny, I heard the Holt Ranch has been looking for you. Something about a disagreement over land rights, and money, lot of money. Calder's jaw clenched. I don't owe them anything. That's not what they say. I don't care what they say. Danner took another step forward. The street had gone quiet. People were watching now, standing in doorways, peering through windows. Elinor could feel their eyes on her, on him, on both of them. You know what I think, Danner said softly. I think you're a thief. I think you took something that didn't belong to you, and now you're hiding behind a widow's skirts, hoping no one will come looking. Calder's hands curled into fists. Don't, Elinor said quietly. He's not worth it. But Danner wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. Or maybe you're not a thief. Maybe you're just a coward, son of a man who built an empire on lies and theft. And you don't have the spine to stand up and claim it. So you run, and you hide, and you let good people pay for your family's sins. The words hit like a whip. Elinor saw Calder flinch, saw the flash of something raw and wounded cross his face before he buried it again. That's enough, she said sharply. Danner smiled. Just saying what everyone's thinking, Mrs. Hayes. Man like him doesn't belong here. And if you're smart, you'll send him on his way before he brings his trouble to your door. He stepped aside, gesturing to the road ahead. But you do what you think is right. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Elinor didn't wait. She snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward, pulling the wagon past Danner and down the muddy street. She didn't look back, didn't speak, just kept her eyes on the road and drove. Beside her, Calder sat in silence, his face like stone. They were a mile outside of town when he finally spoke. I'm sorry. Elinor didn't answer. I should have told you, he said, who I was, what name I carried. I should have. Yes. Elinor cut him off, her voice cold. You should have. He looked at her then, but she kept her eyes on the road. I didn't lie to you, he said quietly. You didn't tell the truth either. I know. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The sky had turned gray, the sun hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. The air smelled like rain. When they reached the ranch, Elinor set the brake and climbed down. She didn't wait for him, just walked into the house and shut the door behind her. Calder stood in the yard alone, the wind pulling at his coat. Inside, Elinor leaned against the door and closed her eyes. She could still hear Danner's voice, could still see the way the town had looked at them, like they were guilty of something, like they'd already been tried and judged. And maybe they had. She pulled the deed from her pocket and unfolded it, staring at the name written there in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Calder Holt, heir to the ranch that had destroyed her family. The man she'd saved from the storm, the man she'd almost trusted. Elinor folded the paper again and set it on the table. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. That night, she saw the torches. They appeared on the ridge just after midnight, small flickering points of light moving through the darkness like fireflies. But they weren't fireflies, they were men, maybe a dozen of them, carrying torches and rifles and anger. Elinor stood on the porch, her own rifle in her hands, watching them come. Calder appeared beside her, his face grim. They're not here for me, he said quietly. They're here for you, because you sheltered me. Elinor didn't look at him. Then they're going to be disappointed. The torches stopped at the edge of her property, just beyond the fence line. She could see their faces now in the flickering light. Danner was there, Brennan. A few others she recognized, men she'd known her whole life, men who'd sat at her table, who'd worked her father's land. Danner stepped forward, his voice carrying across the distance. Mrs. Hayes, send the Holt boy out. This doesn't have to involve you. Elinor stepped down off the porch into the yard, the rifle across her chest. Her voice was steady, cold. You're on my land, Sheriff. Turn around and go home. Can't do that. Not until we settle this. There's nothing to settle. He's working for me. That's all you need to know. That's not what the town thinks. I don't care what the town thinks. The men behind Danner shifted, murmuring. Elinor could feel their eyes on her, judging, deciding. You're making a mistake. Danner said, no. Elinor said quietly, you are. She raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it. Ready? The yard went silent. For a long moment, no one moved. The torches flickered. The wind blew cold across the valley. Then, slowly, Danner stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Elena replied. "Now get off my land." The men hesitated. Then, one by one, they turned and walked back into the darkness, their torches fading until there was nothing left but night. Elena stood there until she was sure they were gone. Then she lowered the rifle and turned back to the house. Calder was still standing on the porch, staring at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked past him and went inside. Behind her, the door closed softly, and in the darkness, the wind carried the smell of smoke and rain. And when the flames faded, only ashes and truth were left to speak for them. The rain came just before dawn, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Elena lay awake listening to it, her body rigid beneath the blankets, her mind turning over the events of the previous night again and again like stones in a river. She'd stood against her own town, against men she'd known since childhood, for a man whose name alone had once meant ruin. She didn't know if that made her brave or foolish, maybe both. Downstairs, she heard movement. Calder was already awake. She heard the scrape of the chair, the quiet clink of the coffee pot, the creak of the floorboards as he crossed to the window. She wondered if he'd slept at all, wondered if he was packing, getting ready to leave before the trouble followed him here again. Part of her hoped he was. Another part, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, hoped he wasn't. She dressed slowly, pulling on her worn work dress and her father's old cardigan, the one with the elbows patched in mismatched fabric. When she came downstairs, Calder was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He looked up when she entered. "Morning," he said quietly. Elena nodded and poured herself coffee. She stood at the stove, her back to him, listening to the rain. "I'll be gone by noon," Calder said. Elena's hand tightened around the cup. She didn't turn around. "Where will you go?" "Don't know. Somewhere else. They'll follow you. Maybe. They'll think you're guilty of whatever they've decided you're guilty of. Probably." Elena turned then, her eyes sharp. "You don't even care, do you?" Calder looked at her for a long moment. His face was tired, drawn, but his eyes were steady. "I care," he said quietly. "I just don't know how to fix it. You could start by telling the truth." "Which truth?" "That I'm a Holt. They already know that. That I didn't steal from my family. They won't believe it. That I came here by accident, and you saved my life. That won't matter to them either." He leaned back in his chair. "Truth doesn't fix anything when people have already made up their minds about who you are." Elena set her cup down hard on the table. "So you just run. I leave, there's a difference, is there?" Calder stood. He crossed to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked yard. "I didn't ask you to defend me last night. You did that on your own. I wasn't defending you. I was defending my land, my right to hire who I want." Was that all it was? The question hung in the air between them. Elena didn't answer, couldn't answer, because she didn't know anymore. After a long silence, Calder spoke again. "My father built the Holt Ranch on land that didn't belong to him. He bought debts from banks, called in loans early, foreclosed on families who couldn't pay. Your father was one of them." He turned to face her. "I was 17 when it happened. I didn't know what he was doing until it was too late. By then, a dozen families had lost everything." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "And you just let it happen." "I was a kid. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Not when the man making the decisions owns everything you have, including your name." Calder's jaw tightened. "When I turned 21, I tried to make it right. I found the families my father had ruined, offered them compensation. Some took it, some told me to go to hell. Most just slammed the door in my face." He looked down at his hands. "Your father was one of the ones who wouldn't even open the door." Eleanor's breath caught. "You came here, to this ranch. 8 years ago, I stood on that porch and knocked for 10 minutes. He finally opened the door, looked me in the eye, and told me no amount of money would bring back what my family took from him. Then he shut the door." Calder's voice was quiet, almost hollow. "He was dead 3 months later. I heard about it from a lawyer settling his debts. By then, it was too late to try again." Elinor stood frozen, her mind reeling. She remembered that day, remembered her father coming back inside, his face pale, his hands shaking. He'd sat at this same table and stared at the wall for hours. She'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd just shaken his head. Some ghosts don't rest, he'd said. They just keep coming back. She'd thought he was talking about the land. But maybe he'd been talking about guilt, about chances lost, about forgiveness he couldn't give. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. You still would have hated me, just for a different reason." Elinor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not just weariness, not just shame, but grief. The kind that settled into bones and never left. "I don't hate you," she said finally. Calder's eyes met hers. "You should, maybe, but I don't." They stood there in the quiet, the rain the only sound between them. Then Calder turned back to the window. "I'll still be gone by noon." Elinor wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him to stay, to fight, to stop running from something that wasn't his fault. But she didn't, because part of her understood. Some things couldn't be fought. They could only be survived. "All right," she said. She walked upstairs and left him there, staring out at the rain. But she didn't make it to her room. Halfway up the stairs, she smelled it. Smoke. Her heart stopped. She turned and ran back down, her boots pounding on the wood. Calder was already moving, throwing open the door and running out into the rain. Elinor followed, and the moment she stepped outside, she saw it. The barn was burning. Not the whole thing, not yet. But flames were crawling up the eastern wall, fed by the dry wood and old hay inside. The rain was coming down hard, but not hard enough. The fire was spreading. The horses, Elinor screamed. Calder was already running. He hit the barn door at full speed, threw it open, and disappeared into the smoke. Elinor ran after him, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. Inside, the air was thick and hot, the smoke so dense she could barely see. She heard the horses screaming high, panicked sounds that tore through her chest. She stumbled forward, hands outstretched, until she found the first stall. She threw the latch and pulled the door open. The mare inside reared, died, and bolted past her toward the open door. Elinor moved to the next stall. Then the next. Her hands were shaking. Her throat was raw. Somewhere in the smoke, she heard Calder shouting, "Elinor, get out. Not without the horses. They're out. Get out now." A beam above her head cracked. She looked up just in time to see it start to fall. She tried to move, tried to run, but her boot caught on something, and she went down hard, her head cracking against the floor. The world tilted. The smoke turned black. And then there were hands on her, pulling her up, dragging her toward the light. Calder hauled her out of the barn and into the rain, both of them collapsing in the mud 20 feet from the door. Elinor coughed, gasped, her lungs screaming for air. Calder knelt beside her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide. "You all right?" Elinor nodded, still coughing. "The horses, they're out, all of them." She turned her head and saw them scattered across the pasture, shaken but alive. Relief flooded through her, so strong it almost hurt. Behind them, the barn groaned. The roof caved in with a sound like thunder, sending up a shower of sparks that the rain swallowed before they could spread. The fire roared once, then began to die, smothered by water and its own hunger. Elinor and Calder sat in the mud and watched it burn. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left but blackened timber and ash. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet charcoal and ruin. Elinor stood at the edge of what used to be the barn, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the wreckage. Everything was gone. The tools, the feed, the tack, the saddles her father had made by hand, the bridle Thomas had given her on their wedding day, all of it, gone. Calder came up beside her. His coat was burned at the sleeves. His hands were blistered. It was deliberate. He said quietly. Elinor didn't look at him. "I know. Danner or someone he sent. I know." They stood in silence, "I'm sorry," Calder said. Elinor closed her eyes. "So am I." She walked back to the house, climbed the stairs, and went to her room. She sat on the bed and stared at the wall. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. Too empty. An hour later, she heard the door downstairs open and close. She went to the window and looked out. Calder was walking down the road, his coat slung over his shoulder, his hat pulled low. He didn't look back. Just kept walking until the ridge swallowed him and he was gone. Elinor stood at the window for a long time, watching the empty road. On the table downstairs, tucked beneath her coffee mug, was a folded piece of paper. She found it that evening when the light had faded and the house had grown too quiet to bear. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was rough, uneven, but clear. "You gave me more home than I deserved. I'm sorry I couldn't give you anything but trouble in return. The deed to the eastern pasture is yours, always was legally. My father just never filed the release. I left the paperwork with the land office in Benton. It won't fix what was taken, but maybe it's a start. Thank you for seeing me as more than my name." Elinor read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley, dark now except for the faint glow of stars beginning to appear through the breaking clouds. The barn was gone. The man was gone. And she was alone again. But something had changed. She'd stood her ground. She'd chosen mercy over bitterness. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth something. Outside, the night was cool and still. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, but beneath it, she could smell rain, soaked earth. New grass, the promise of spring. Elinor closed her eyes and let herself breathe. The silence wasn't as heavy as it used to be. And somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the dark. But from the ruins of the past, justice began to ride again, this time wearing Mercy's face. The road to Holt Ranch cut through the valley like a scar, winding through scrub brush and red clay, climbing toward the high plateau where the land stretched flat and hard beneath an unforgiving sky. Calder had walked it once as a boy, riding beside his father in a wagon loaded with deeds and legal papers, watching families pack their belongings and leave behind everything they'd built. He'd walked it again at 21, trying to undo what couldn't be undone. And now he walked it a 3rd time, knowing this would be the last. The sun was high and merciless. The air shimmered with heat, turning the distant mountains into wavering ghosts. Calder's boots kicked up dust with every step, his shadow a dark slash trailing behind him. His hands were still blistered from the fire, wrapped in strips of cloth Elinor had insisted he take before he left. He hadn't wanted them, but she'd pressed them into his hands anyway, her eyes red, rimmed and tired, and he hadn't been able to refuse. He'd been walking for 2 days. The first night, he'd slept in a dry wash, his coat pulled over his head, listening to coyotes sing to the moon. The second night, he'd kept walking, too restless to stop, too angry to rest. The anger had been building since he'd left Elinor's ranch, growing with every mile, every memory, every scar his family's name had left on this valley. He was done running. The ranch came into view just before noon, a sprawling compound of wooden buildings and corrals, barns and bunkhouses, all clustered around a main house that sat like a clenched fist on the highest point of the plateau. It hadn't changed. Same whitewashed walls, same iron gates, same brand burned into the sign that hung over the entrance. The Holt Ranch, built on theft, maintained by cruelty, and ruled by his uncle, Marcus Holt, the man who'd inherited everything when Calder's father died and Calder had refused to come back. Calder stopped at the gate. 2 men stood guard, ranch hands with rifles slung over their shoulders. They straightened when they saw him, their eyes narrowing. "Help you?" one of them asked. "I'm here to see Marcus. He expecting you." "No." The man's hand drifted toward his rifle. "Then maybe you should come back when he is." Calder stepped closer. "Tell him Calder's here. He'll see me." The 2 men exchanged a glance. Then one of them turned and walked toward the main house. The other stayed, his eyes never leaving Calder's face. They waited in silence. 5 minutes later, the door to the main house opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Marcus Holt. He stood there for a moment, staring down at Calder, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Well," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Look what the desert dragged in. Didn't think you had the spine to come back here, boy." Calder didn't answer, just stood there waiting. Marcus waved a hand, let him through. The guard stepped aside. Calder walked through the gate and across the yard, his boots crunching on gravel, his eyes fixed on the man waiting for him. He climbed the steps to the porch and stopped 3 feet from his uncle. Up close, Marcus looked older than he remembered. The gray in his hair had spread, the lines around his mouth had deepened, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and completely without mercy. "You look like hell," Marcus said. "I've had a rough winter." "So I heard. Heard you were hiding out at the Hayes place, playing ranch hand." Marcus leaned against the porch railing. "That must have stung. Working the land your daddy took from them." "I didn't come here to talk about Eleanor Hayes." "No. Then what did you come here for?" Calder met his uncle's eyes. "I want the debts forgiven, all of them. Every family my father ruined, every contract he manipulated, every piece of land he stole, I want it undone." Marcus stared at him. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound that echoed across the empty yard. "You want what? You heard me. Boy, those debts are the foundation of everything we own. You forgive them, this ranch collapses." "Good." Marcus stopped laughing. His smile faded. "You really are a fool." "Maybe, but I'm done carrying this name like it's something to be proud of. That name built an empire. It built a graveyard." Marcus pushed off the railing and stepped closer. His voice dropped, dangerous and quiet. "You think you can just walk in here and tear down everything your father and I spent our lives building? You think you have that right? I have his name. That gives me the right. His name doesn't mean anything anymore. I'm the one who runs this ranch now. I'm the one who holds the deeds, the contracts, the power. You're just a ghost pretending to be a man. Then let me be a ghost. Let me undo the damage and disappear." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the door. "Come inside. We'll talk." Calder hesitated. Then he followed. The inside of the house was dark and cool, the air heavy with the smell of cigar smoke and old leather. Marcus led him to a study, a large room lined with bookshelves and mounted animal heads, a massive oak desk dominating the center. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Calder. "Sit." Calder didn't sit. He set the glass down on the desk untouched. Marcus shrugged and drank both glasses himself. "You always were stubborn, just like your father. I'm nothing like him. No, you carry his name, his blood, his guilt. Sounds pretty similar to me. The guilt is why I'm here." Marcus set the glasses down and crossed to the window. He stood there, looking out at the land that stretched to the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your father and I made this place what it is," he said quietly. "We took a dying territory and turned it into something that mattered. We gave people work, gave them stability, gave them a future. You took their land. We bought their land, legally. You manipulated the law to suit yourself. That's called business, boy." Marcus turned to face him. "And if you think tearing it all down is going to fix anything, you're wrong. Those families are gone. That land is gone. You can't bring any of it back. I can try. And what will it cost you? Your name, your inheritance, your future." Marcus shook his head. "You'll destroy yourself trying to save people who don't even remember you exist." "I don't care." "Yes, you do. That's why you've been running for 8 years. Because you care too much, and it's eating you alive." Calder's jaw clenched. "Sign the releases, dissolve the contracts, let the workers go. No. Then I'll do it myself. With what authority? You walked away from this ranch. You have no claim here. I have my father's blood. That's all the claim I need." Marcus's expression darkened. You want to fight me, boy. You want to drag this family's name through the courts and the papers and see who comes out on top. He stepped closer. Go ahead, try, but I promise you by the time it's over, there won't be anything left for anyone. Not you, not me, not the families you're trying to save. Then we'll all burn together. Marcus stared at him. Then, slowly, his hand moved to the desk drawer. Calder saw it. Saw the shift in his uncle's posture. Saw the decision in his eyes. Don't, Calder said quietly. Marcus pulled the drawer open. Inside was a revolver. You're not the only one who's willing to burn, boy. Calder's hand moved to his belt, where a knife he'd borrowed from Elinor's barn hung in a worn sheath. But he didn't draw it. He just stood there, watching his uncle's hand hover over the gun. Go ahead, Calder said softly. Pull it, shoot me, add one more body to the pile this family's built. See if it makes you sleep any better. Marcus's hand trembled. For a moment he looked old, tired, almost human. Then he slammed the drawer shut. Get out, he said, his voice hoarse. Get out of my house. Calder didn't move, not until you sign the papers. I said get out. The door behind them burst open. 3 ranch hands rushed in, guns drawn. Calder turned, his hand still on the knife, his body tense. And then another voice cut through the room. Put the guns down. Everyone froze. Elinor Hayes stood in the doorway, a shotgun in her hands, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She looked like she'd ridden hard and fast, and from the look in her eyes, she wasn't leaving without answers. Mrs. Hayes, Marcus said slowly, this is a private matter. Not anymore. Elinor stepped into the room, the shotgun never wavering. I rode 2 days to get here. I'm not leaving until I know what's going on. Calder stared at her. What are you doing here, finishing what you started? She looked at Marcus. I found the deed you left at the land office, Calder. The one releasing my father's property. But there were others, dozens of them. All signed by your father, all filed but never released. She took another step forward. Marcus Holt has been holding them, using them to control people who don't even know they're free. Marcus's face went pale. Elinor's voice was steady, cold. You're going to release them, all of them, right now, or what? Marcus spat. You'll shoot me? No, Elinor said. I'll make sure every family in this valley knows what you've been hiding. I'll make sure every paper from here to Denver prints the truth. And then I'll watch this ranch crumble while you try to explain why you've been lying for 20 years. The room went silent. Marcus looked at her, then at Calder, then at the men behind him. Slowly, he walked to the desk. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger and threw it onto the surface. There, he said bitterly, all the contracts, all the deeds, take them. Burn this place to the ground for all I care. Calder stepped forward and picked up the ledger. He opened it, scanning the pages, seeing name after name families he remembered. Families he'd tried to help. Families that had been trapped for decades. He looked at Elinor. She nodded. Together they walked out of the house, the ledger under Calder's arm, the shotgun still in Elinor's hands. Behind them, Marcus stood alone in the study, staring at the empty desk. Outside, the sun was starting to set. The sky had turned red and gold, painting the plateau in fire and shadow. Elinor and Calder walked to the gate, mounted the horses she'd brought, and rode down the long, dusty road toward the valley. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Behind them, the Holt Ranch stood silent against the darkening sky, and above them, the first drops of rain began to fall. And as the dust settled over the ranch, a gentler season began to breathe through the land. The wildflowers came in late April, carpeting the meadow below Elinor's ranch in waves of yellow and purple, so bright they looked painted. She stood on the rebuilt porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the morning light spill across the valley like honey. The air smelled clean pine and wet earth and new growth. Spring had taken its time, but it had finally arrived. Behind her, the sound of hammering rang steady and sure. Calder was working on the new barn, finishing the frame they'd started together 3 weeks ago. It wasn't as large as the old one. They didn't need it to be, but it was solid, built to last. built with hands that knew the cost of losing everything and the value of starting again. Elinor took a sip of coffee and closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun settle into her bones. She'd forgotten what peace felt like. Forgotten that mornings could be quiet without being empty. That silence could feel like rest instead of grief. It had been 2 months since they'd returned from Holt Ranch. 2 months since they'd filed the releases at the land office in Benton. Watching the clerk's eyes widen as he realized what he was holding, deeds that should have been freed decades ago. Families that should have been released from debts they'd never truly owed. The news had spread fast, faster than either of them expected. Within a week, families had started showing up, some in tears, some in disbelief, some just standing in the doorway of the land office staring at the papers like they might disappear if they blinked. Elinor and Calder hadn't stayed to see it. They'd ridden back to Cedar Bend in silence, side by side, the weight of what they'd done settling over them like snow. The town had changed after that. Not quickly. Not all at once, but slowly, like ice thawing at the edges. Sheriff Danner had kept his distance, his eyes hard but his tongue quiet. Mr. Brennan had nodded to Elinor the next time she came into the mercantile, a small gesture, but one that mattered. Others followed, a few words here, a tipped hat there. The kind of acknowledgement that said maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong. Not everyone came around. Some still looked at Calder like he was something poisonous. Some crossed the street when they saw him coming, but he didn't run. He stayed. He worked. And slowly, brick by brick, he built a place for himself that had nothing to do with his name and everything to do with his hands. Elinor finished her coffee and walked down the steps into the yard. The grass was coming back, soft and green where the snow had flattened it. The horses grazed in the near pasture, their coats sleek and shining in the sunlight. She'd kept them all after the fire. Calder had helped her rebuild the corral, and together they'd brought the herd back from the edge of starvation. She walked to the barn and stopped in the doorway, watching him work. He had his back to her, his shirt damp with sweat, his hammer ringing against nails with a rhythm that felt almost like music. He didn't notice her at first, just kept working, focused, steady, the way he did everything. "You're going to work yourself to death," Elinor said. Calder looked over his shoulder and smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that came easier now, but still felt rare enough to notice. Says the woman who was up before dawn checking fence lines. "That's different. That's my job." "This is my job too." Elinor stepped inside. The barn smelled like fresh, cut wood and sawdust. The frame was nearly finished, the roof half shingled. In another week, maybe 2, it would be done. She ran her hand along one of the beams, feeling the smoothness of the planed wood beneath her palm. "It's good work," she said quietly. "It's honest work," Calder replied. He set the hammer down and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "That's all I wanted it to be." Elinor looked at him. He'd changed since the winter. The hardness in his face had softened. The shadows under his eyes had faded. He smiled more, laughed sometimes even. He looked like a man who'd finally stopped carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders and realized he could stand without it. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Calder met her eyes. "Every day." Her chest tightened. "And then I remember why I stayed," he continued quietly, "and I stopped thinking about it." Elinor held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back outside, her heart beating faster than it should. That afternoon, they rode into town together. Elinor needed supplies, and Calder had promised to pick up nails from the blacksmith. The road was dry now, the mud baked hard by the sun, and the horses moved easy and smooth beneath them. Cedar Bend looked different in the spring light, brighter, less severe. The church steeple stood white against the blue sky. Flowers bloomed in window boxes outside the mercantile. Children played in the street, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Elinor and Calder tied the horses outside Brennan's store and walked inside together. The bell rang. Brennan looked up from behind the counter, his eyes flicking between them. Then he nodded. Mrs. Hayes Calder. Mr. Brennan, Elena replied. She handed him her list. Brennan scanned it, then started gathering supplies. As he worked, he spoke without looking at them. Heard what you did. Up at the Holt Ranch. Elena and Calder exchanged a glance. Heard you freed a lot of families. Brennan continued. He set a sack of flour on the counter. My cousin was one of them. He'd been paying on a debt for 15 years. Thought he'd die before it was cleared. He looked up then, his eyes steady. You gave him his life back. Calder shifted, uncomfortable. I just did what should have been done a long time ago. Maybe, but you're the one who did it. Brennan pushed the supplies across the counter. That counts for something. Elena paid, and they carried the supplies back to the wagon in silence. As they loaded the bags, a woman approached, older, gray-haired, with kind eyes and worn hands. Elena recognized her. Mrs. Coulter. Her husband had lost his ranch to the Holts 30 years ago. She stopped in front of Calder and looked up at him. You're Samuel Holt's boy, she said. Calder nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Coulter studied his face for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Thank you, she whispered. My daughter got her land back because of you. She's got a home now, a future. Her eyes filled with tears. I never thought I'd live to see that. Calder's throat worked. He didn't trust his voice. He just nodded. Mrs. Coulter squeezed his hand once more, then turned and walked away. Elena watched him. Watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. She stepped closer and touched his arm. You all right? He nodded, but his voice when it came was rough. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Live with forgiveness. I spent so long carrying guilt. I don't know what to do now that it's gone. Elena's hand stayed on his arm. You live, Calder. You just live. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted. Something open and unguarded and almost afraid. Elena, don't, she said softly. Not yet. He nodded. Understood. They climbed onto the wagon and rode back to the ranch as the sun arced toward the west, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. That evening, they sat on the porch together, watching the light fade over the valley. The air was cool but not cold, comfortable. A jug of water sat between them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Elena broke the silence. I've been thinking, she said. This ranch is too much for one person, even with help. Calder glanced at her. You thinking of selling? No, I'm thinking of sharing it. He went still. Elena kept her eyes on the horizon. There's a lawyer in Benton. He said we could file a partnership. Equal shares, equal work. Hayes and Holt Ranch. She paused. If you want it. Calder didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring out at the land that had taken so much from both of them and given back so little. Why? He asked finally. Because you've earned it. Because this land needs someone who understands what it cost. And because. She stopped, took a breath. Because I don't want to do this alone anymore. Calder turned to look at her. His eyes were bright in the fading light. You sure? I'm sure. He nodded slowly. Then he held out his hand. Elena took it. They shook, firm and steady, sealing a promise that felt like more than business. It felt like belonging. Summer came soft and warm. The hay grew tall in the fields. The barn was finished, its new wood already weathering to silver. Children from town started coming by on Sundays, playing in the creek, chasing the horses through the pasture. Elena let them. Calder taught them how to ride, patient and careful, his voice steady and kind. The sign went up in July. Hayes and Holt Ranch Partners in Stewardship. It hung over the gate, carved and painted by hand, a declaration and a promise. The town came to accept it, not all at once, but gradually. The way trust always comes slow and hard. 1. Marcus Holt never came back to the valley. Rumor said he'd sold what was left of the ranch and moved east. No one missed him. One evening in late August, Elena stood at the fence watching the sun set. The sky was on fire, red and orange and gold bleeding into purple. The air smelled like warm grass and horses and dust. Calder came up beside her, his hands in his pockets. Beautiful, he said. It is. They stood in silence, watching the light fade. "You ever regret it?" Calder asked quietly. "Letting me stay?" Elinor thought about it. Thought about the storm that had brought him, the fire that had taken so much, the choices she'd made that had cost her safety, but given her something else. Something she hadn't known she needed. "No," she said, "I don't." Calder nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He just stood there, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. And Elinor realized she didn't need him to say it. She already knew. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. The land stretched out before them, quiet and patient and full of promise. Elinor closed her eyes and breathed it in. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The storm had passed, the fire had burned, the debts had been forgiven. And what remained was this: two people, one piece of land, and the quiet understanding that sometimes mercy was the bravest thing you could offer, and sometimes it was the only thing that could save you. The sun dipped below the ridge, and the stars began to appear, one by one, like small lights being lit across the darkening sky. Elinor whispered a thank you to the wind for the storm, for the stranger, for the second chance they'd both been given. And the wind, soft and steady, carried it away. Above them, a hawk circled high and free, riding the last currents of the day. The land remembered kindness now, and it would not forget.